Welcome back to Zero to Hero. Today's topic is how to adjust in best of 3 sets. The main point today is playing better in these best of 3 sets compared to single games, and how to adjust between games within a set of best of 3. We will also briefly consider what a best of 3 set is and why we use them. For context, we'll consider that first. Best of 3 matches, or sets, are very common in games, sports, and competitions of all kinds. When you play any game, there is usually at least a little bit of variance that can cause the more skilled player to lose. For example, perhaps adverse weather or worn equipment in sports, and of course things like critical hits and move accuracy in Pokémon. In competitions, we want the best players to come out on top due to their skill and not random variants like these. In order to ensure that the outcome of games is actually representative of which player is better, we play 3 games against each opponent rather than just 1. This minimizes the effect any single instance of variance has on determining the winner of the game. In Pokemon, best of 3 games are often called a set, whereas a single game is simply called a game or a match, and the first player to win 2 of those 3 games wins the set. For example, a skilled player may lose a game due to missing Heat Wave on both opponents, an unlikely 1 out of 100 chance. But they haven't lost the set. They still have the opportunity to play and win 2 more games, and if they win both, then they'll win the set. Overall, using best of 3 sets allows more skilled players to win more games more often and is almost always a good thing. This does add another layer of complexity to gameplay and strategy, which is what we'll discuss. So how do you play a best of 3 differently? Just before we get into it, I wanted to say a huge thanks for us reaching the milestone of 2,000 subscribers. It really means a lot. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe for more VGC instructional content. Adjusting within a set is the main thing that separates best of 3 sets from single matches. So what exactly does it mean to adjust in Pokemon? It means changing the Pokemon you picked and or the way you played in your subsequent games based on how the first game played out. For example, if you're playing a best of 3 set and lose game 1, if both you and your opponent make the exact same moves game 2, you'll just lose again and lose the set. So that doesn't make it very interesting, aside from the aforementioned reducing variance. What does make best of 3 so interesting is the fact that you're able to take a completely different approach to game 2 than you did game 1. Not only can you bring different Pokemon and make different plays, but you get to do so with the knowledge of what happened to game 1 and how your opponent plays. This adds a ton of strategy to the game. So let's look at some general scenarios of best of 3 sets, specifically what kind of adjustments you can make, and when you should use each type of adjustment. After the general scenarios, we have replays that fit specific examples of each. The ways you adjust is different for if you win or lose your first game. So let's consider what you can do when you win first. After winning a game, I find there are 3 general approaches you can take when adjusting into your next game. From most common to least common, they are 1. Do the same thing. If you find you had a solid grasp on the game and were ahead the whole time, do the same thing and use your same game plan. You had the upper hand and the stronger strategy in the current matchup. It really is on your opponent to adapt and try to win since you're already ahead. What I mean by doing the same thing is at least using some similar strategy to what you used the first time. Do not necessarily make the exact same moves and plays each time. This will lead you to becoming very predictable and let your opponent adjust much easier. So when I say do the same thing, I don't mean do exactly the same thing as last time, but follow your same strategy. 2. Use a secondary mode or game plan. Use this tactic in one of 2 scenarios. If you find after winning your first game, you didn't have a very strong hold on the match compared to our first scenario, and or you suspect your opponent has the tools or knowledge to exploit the game plan you first used, or if the game was pretty close and you're not super confident you'll beat your opponent again with the same strategy. In both of these situations, you can try mixing up your team into game 2 to use a different game plan or strategy. While your opponent is likely preparing to face the first strategy you used, you choosing a different strategy can throw their adjustments way off. 3. Adjust to their game plan. If you did not have a strong hold on the game at all, and you find you barely won just from getting a lucky read or important critical hit, you will likely need to adjust. If you only won due to some variance, repeating the same scenario as game 1 will likely lead to your opponent winning, so you should adjust to how they played and specifically try to counter that. What about if you lost your first match? Here we have 2 general options you can take. 1. Adjust to what beat you. Do this when you firmly lost game 1 and your opponent had the upper hand. Since you were defeated, the onus is on you to make adjustments. If your opponent had a stronghold on the match, they will likely use the same or a similar game plan to beat you again. So use a different strategy that can beat whatever they used game 1. This second option is much less likely when you've lost, but it's to do the same thing and not get tilted. I mentioned when you lose, the onus really is on you to adjust to try to beat your opponent, but in this type of scenario where you played game 1 and really you should have won it and only lost due to an unfortunate critical hit or miss, just do the same thing because the odds are in your favor that you'll win the same scenario if you repeat it. You could also do the same thing if you found yourself in the situation where the match was really close and they just barely won, but you're confident with the knowledge gained of how your opponent played game 1 that you can beat them if you run the same matchup. So what exactly can you do to adjust? I found there are 5 things that you can do to make an adjustment. 1. Change the Pokemon brought. 2. Change your Pokemon's positioning. 3. Change the moves you use. 4. Change your targets. And 5. Change your game plan. These are pretty self-explanatory, but breaking it down into these options makes adjusting easier to think about while you're playing a game. Perhaps you realize that you can still win the game if you use the same Pokemon, but maybe you just need to change the moves you used, or change which Pokemon you had in the front and which ones you had in the back. Sometimes, however, you will need to change your whole game plan, but knowing which of these you need to do and which of them you don't also gives you another leg up. Also, no matter if you win or lose, you should always be thinking about making adjustments based on what your opponent did and how they played. Since these are just general guidelines, and adjusting in any given set is so highly specific to that exact set, this is all the general criteria we'll go over for now, but we'll jump into some specific examples of replays that display each of these general criteria very well. So with that, let's jump into these specific examples. Our first set is a great example of how both the winner using option 1, which is doing the same thing, and the loser using option 1, which is adjusting to the opponent. We see here our opponent is leading Clefable and Kingambit trying to set up, so we use Mouse Hold to try and eliminate the Clefable early. Kingambit does get a Swords Dance up, but we're able to deal solid damage while removing the Clefable. We then Terrastallize our Chaladon to resist the powerful Sucker Punch and start increasing our defense. Our game plan now is to win with our Chaladon, which we easily secure with more support from Mouse Hold and our Rain Core in the back of Pelipper and Basculegion to clean up. As we see, both of these Pokemon they have really can't touch our Chaladon by doing much damage. The Moonblast there does 23 at the most, and with Grassy Terrain recovery, again, they really just can't chip down our Chaladon fast enough until we switch in with our Rain Core. So if you are on the receiving end of this is likely our opponent's thought process moving into game 2. They know that they need to adjust to our Mouse Hold / our Chaladon lead. They probably think that they need to remove our Chaladon since it did the most damage, and that their Kingambit is not really great in this matchup. They do have Volcarona, which can resist our Chaladon's attacks by using Quiver Dance and setting up and increasing its special defense. It also has Flame Body, which will significantly dissuade us from attacking it with a Mouse Hold, since with 10 hits, we're very likely to burn ourselves and not being able to one-shot it. So they'll probably want to use Volcarona somehow in this matchup. We can tell by the way this player played that they're probably a setup player, since they have 2 setup Pokemon and a redirector, so they probably want to set up with Volcarona somehow. So we see our Lex leads, and we do the same thing by eliminating the Clefable, but a Population Bomb miss prevents us from doing that, unfortunately. They, however, do follow through with their game plan by adjusting and using Volcarona, setting up, walling our Chaladon, and eventually sweeping with Volcarona. Here we see with the Terrastalization from Volcarona to Grass, allows it to resist our water attacks, and just with 3 Quiver Dances, it's able to steamroll the rest of our team. Now, the onus is on us to adjust in game 3. Since this plan won for them, they're likely to use it again, as they had a pretty strong hold on the match and they didn't even lose a single Pokemon. So our thought process, being the loser from game 2, adjusting into game 3. I need to KO Volcarona before it can set up, because it gets out of hand pretty quickly. But how will we do this with Clefable support? The answers I found here were to lead with huge damage in Basculegion and Kingambit. We know Volcarona is very likely to set up turn 1, so we can try and KO it while it's setting up. They will also probably follow me, but Terra Water Wave Crash just might pick up a 1-hit even without the rain. So we're going to go for that, and we'll try to set up with Kingambit, since the chances that they Heat Wave turn 1 are not high. The Wave Crash doesn't quite KO, but Aqua Jet KOs afterwards. And since we've set up with a +2 Swords Dance, our Sucker Punch will one-shot Volcarona now because it has pretty low defense. With a Terra type of Grass, it doesn't matter if it Terras or not, Sucker Punch will KO. And if they do set up more, we have Basculegion pressure going forward. After that adjustment into that Volcarona lead, we've pretty much secured the game since we have 4 Pokemon left to only their 2, and we easily clean up from there. This was a perfect match displaying option 1 of winning and option 1 of losing, with the winner using the same thing that won and the loser adjusting appropriately. We can see that the loser adjusted each game perfectly to what the opponent won last game, allowing them to take the win. This may make you wonder though if going with the same strategy after winning is really the plan if it just allows your opponent to adjust. This does depend on the matchup and if your opponent can adjust to it. I thought my Mousehold Archaludon lead was going to clean up game 2, but that population bomb miss really set us back. Even if it did pick up the KO on Clefable, that Volcarona still would have been difficult to deal with if it was able to Quiver Dance again. They likely saw that Volcarona can sweep if Clefable goes down either way, so we knew we needed to adjust even when our Population Bomb missed. Again, you can see how adjusting really is so specific to each match. Let's consider an example of winning option 2, switching it up to keep your opponent on their toes. Here, we know that both our Gholdengo and their Typhlosion have a Choice Scarf. Typhlosion is likely faster, so we plan to Terrastalize to survive a Shadow Ball and return with a KO of our own. But our opponent goes for a hard read turn 1, predicting our Terra and using Fake Out into our Terra Water Gholdengo. Turn 2, we are set back pretty significantly, being down 2 Pokemon with no damage on the board due to that critical close combat. But with a good Protect and no more RNG setbacks from Dire Claw, we're able to take the game back with Dragonite to win. So how will we adjust going into game 2? Even though we won game 1, our turns 1 and 2 were disasters. Despite a hard read and a critical hit, I believe I should adjust to avoid that type of scenario again. We do not adjust our leads, since I think our lead put us in a good position. We just need to adjust our play around our opponent's crazy reads. And we know a little bit of information about our opponent now and how they play. Getting the rain up early and switching in our Chaludon on that double up from game 1, we are much farther ahead now since we have a Tailwind up as well, and some defense boosts on our Chaludon. Pelipper then picks up a KO, and our Chaludon is quite far ahead. Without one change of our gameplay, and not necessarily our Pokemon, on the first turn we were able to avoid their hard read and clean up the game just as easily as we did game 1, although in a different way. Notice how although we chose the same 2 Pokemon to lead, we did change up the way we played, although our strategy did stay the same. So you could consider this kind of a hybrid of doing the same thing because we chose the same Pokemon, but we changed the moves we chose and the switches we did versus changing any Pokemon we had. Had we done the exact same thing we did game 1, we would have just gotten hit by that Fake Out and Shadow Ball again and been put quite far behind. Next, let's consider the adjustment of doing the same thing when you lose. This is a great example of that, and only losing due to RNG. Shout out to our friend Volan for this replay using a pretty similar team. Game 1, our friend here unfortunately gets pretty steamrolled by this Electabuzz / Blood Moon Ursaluna matchup. With the speed drop, Ursaluna is able to one-shot our Chaludon with an Earth Power. A little unfortunate with a Scale Shot miss, and the Terra Normal picks up the one-shot on Sinistra, and after that, with the Follow Me support still online, there's not much he can do, so he forfeits. Knowing that we have to adjust game 2, he does make some different plays turn 1. For instance, taking out the Electabuzz here, rather than protecting and getting Guts active, is a huge step in the right direction. Despite losing Sinistra still, we still have some offensive pressure with Pelipper and likely our Chaludon in the back. Pelipper is just able to survive here and get up a Tailwind, allowing our Chaludon to switch in and Terrastalize Fairy to remove that ground weakness, while Ursaluna gets Earthquake damage on both targets. The game does eventually come down to here we see a double Protect and a critical hit Electro Shot, which ends up winning the game. And eventually we see Ursaluna goes down to Life Orb Chip, which was played around throughout the whole match. From our opponent's perspective, they still had a strong hold on the game, and they really only lost that game to that double Protect plus critical hit back-to-back. So they will likely do the same thing that won game 1 and almost won game 2, since it seems very consistent in this matchup. So although they lost the previous game, they opt to do the same strategy because really they should have won it if the RNG evened out. And here we see just that. This game plays out similarly to game 2, so it's a little closer since our friend was able to adjust to that. But with just a few read changes like protecting Electabuzz and Blood Moon Ursaluna getting some massive damage and still, Sneasler and Indeedee are able to close out the game, giving the win to our opponent. Within these 4 games, considering our perspective and our opponent's perspective, we're able to see all 5 of our general adjustment strategies of winning, doing the same thing, winning option 2, using a secondary motor game plan, and winning option 3, adjusting to their game plan. We were also able to see the losers adjust to what beat them quite frequently, as that's the most common, and we were able to see a good example of doing the same thing when you lose due to RNG, and the opponent not getting tilted, still playing well to win out the game. Make sure you analyze games you play while they're happening, and take the time you have to reflect on what you may have lost to, and more importantly, how your opponent plays to help you adjust going into each next game. So knowing the 5 general criteria of how to adjust, and breaking down the specifics of how you adjust, hopefully using this information, you're able to improve your play in best of 3 sets. Thanks for watching.